series. We're in a series called God's Good Gifts. And this is the second week of God's Good Gifts. But before we do anything else, I'm going to ask you to pray with me. So if you just bow your heads, close your eyes. I'm going to ask you to pray with me that God would open your heart this morning to hear His Word. That God would open your mind this morning to understand His Word. And that you would be encouraged and filled by God's good gifts as you hear this morning's message, as you hear this morning's word from God Himself. So just spend a few moments to reflect and pray and ask God to speak into your life. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your word and for this gathering and this opportunity that we have to learn together. But more than learning, God, help us to experience your grace, your provision, your mercy, your good gifts that you have available to us. Help us to see, Lord, that the way in which you are writing this story of the Israelites being freed, this story of the life of Moses, that the way in which you're revealing all of these things to us points to something really, really amazing about how you work in our own life. Pray, Lord, that you would draw us closer to you this morning as we hear your word preached. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, guys, I'm going to ask you to grab your Bibles, and we're going to turn to Exodus chapter 18. Exodus chapter 18. Exodus 18. Now, as you turn there, I'll give you just a little bit of context. So, the book of Exodus is the story of how God rescues His people, the Israelites, from the Egyptians. And one of the interesting things is Exodus 18 is actually sort of the midpoint, the pivot point of the book. In other words, what you have before chapter 18 and what you have after chapter 18 are actually different. Before 18 is all the story stuff. And then after 18 is really God having a conversation with Moses and giving him the law. Okay? So you don't have too much story after this. There's a few stories, but the idea is for the most part, it's going to be Moses settling with the people at the bottom of Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb. It's the same name for the same mountain. Two names for the same mountain. And it's going to be about how Moses kind of fellowships with God and how God gives him the law. But before we get there, chapter 18 is sort of that pivot point. And what's really interesting is we're going to be introduced to a character, to a person, and it almost seems random, like why all of this is happening here. But again, I want to point out something. Okay, the story of Exodus could easily just be about the people of God being pulled out from under this oppressive country, this oppressive nation, the Egyptians. So the Israelites are rescued from slavery by God. Pharaoh is defeated, and kind of move on from there. But really, one of the interesting things about Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy is Moses' life is kind of paralleled alongside this. In other words, you have in the book of Exodus, if you're paying attention, really the way in which God takes care of His people as a whole, but then you also have the way in which God takes care of the individual person. And I think it's important for us to recognize that because you have chapters like chapter 18, right? So let's look at verse 1. So it says this: Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, His people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Right? So we're introduced to another character. Right? So up until this point, you have, it says that Jethro heard all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, His people, how the Lord brought Israel out of Egypt. Right? So this is just a one-sentence summary of who Jethro is and what he's heard about. Okay? So what he's heard about is how God took the Israelites out of Egypt, right? How God rescued them, crossed them through the Red Sea, right? And all before this, we also have like the Israelites complaining and all of this kind of stuff. But the idea is Jethro has heard about this. Now, who is Jethro? We have a couple descriptions. It says he's the priest of Midian. So he's not an Israelite. He's a Midianite, okay? Which is a foreign nation, right? It's a strange country. It says he's also a priest. Now that means that he's not a worshiper of Yahweh God. He doesn't worship the same God Moses does. It means that he's a priest for another foreign God. Okay? And then it says also that he's Moses' father-in-law. So that means that Moses' wife's father is Jethro. And so this is actually a relative of his. So we're introduced right here to Moses' sort of extended family. Now, Jethro is not a stranger to us. If we've been paying attention to the book of Exodus, we'll see actually, Jethro appears when Moses leaves Egypt and he goes into the wilderness. He is actually kind of adopted into Jethro's family, and so that's how he ends up meeting his wife. And so Moses and Jethro have a really good relationship. And it says that actually Jethro heard about everything God had done. So this points to something really interesting. This points to how, yes, God is utilizing Israel, right, to become his people, to show Israel how awesome he is. But because Jethro, who's not an Israelite, has heard about everything that's happened, right, like this is worldwide news, that the Israelite slaves came out of Egypt, and now they're sort of their own independent country, wandering in the wilderness. Like, Jethro's heard about that, which means this is also an indication of how God intends to save the world, right? God intends for stories like this to be given to everybody. And Jethro is one of them that hears about it, and he wants to do something about it. And it says in verse 2, it's going to lay out the situation. Why are we talking about Jethro? Verse 2. Now Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, had taken Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her home, along with her 2 sons. So the reason why Jethro is visiting is because at some point in the journey, after the Israelites leave Egypt, after they cross the Red Sea, Moses actually sends his wife and his 2 sons to be at home with their family. So the wife's side of the family is where everyone is. So it's like when you go to your grandma and grandpa's house, essentially, right? And so I think Moses does that for their safety. Maybe they're crossing dangerous territory, and Moses knows it's going to be a little bit tough for the Israelites. He doesn't want his family to suffer through. Another theory actually is that because they're crossing over this area, they're kind of close to where Jethro is. Let's go visit grandma and grandpa before we leave the wilderness and go into the promised land, because at that point we'll be really, really far away. And so Moses does a really practical thing, allows them to be with and spend time with the father. Now we also get some other detail about Moses' family, right? It says in verse 3, the name of the one, meaning the name of the firstborn son, so Moses' oldest son, his name is Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land, right? So names in this time, the way you were named was actually based on sort of the emotional state of your parents. So how your parents felt at the time you were born is your name. Okay? That's kind of true today, but it's really more about what looks good on a birth certificate. Okay? What sounds good. Like when me and Tracy were picking names for our kids, like there were all these names that we had considered, and we like X'd them based on the way they sounded. Or honestly, if there was somebody whose name if there was somebody we didn't like, but we liked their name, we also X'd it because that name is associated with somebody that we didn't like, and so we're like, nah, forget that, right? But back then, here during this time, the meaning of the name was actually based on sort of where the parents were at that state of life. And so Moses names Gershom, his firstborn son, I have been a sojourner, which means stranger in a foreign land. And so think about it, right? The reason why Gershom is named this way is because Moses, he was born an Israelite, right? But then was raised in the Egyptian palace, right? So he's ethnically an Israelite, but then he also kind of identifies with the Egyptians via education and culture. But religiously, he's still an Israelite as well. So he's got kind of this confused dual identity. Okay? And a lot of us, we should know exactly what that's like. In the sense that you are Korean. Most likely your parents are first generation Korean, meaning they were probably born in Korea and at least went to high school in Korea before they came here, most likely, right? They maybe came here for college or something like that. So you're actually considered second generation. And so you're Korean and you live in a first generation Korean home, but at the same time you are growing up in a Western culture. You're growing up in America. And so you have this sort of dual thing going on inside, right? Are you more Korean? Are you more American? Are you Asian American? Are you Korean American? Like there's lots and lots of ways to kind of define yourself. Sometimes we use food items to define ourselves, like you're a Twinkie, which is you are yellow on the outside, but you're white on the inside. You're a banana, yellow on the outside, soft and chewy on the inside. I don't know. I mean, all sorts of different things that you can do, right? Your kimbap, which is you're black on the outside, you're white kind of on the inside, but you're also yellow a little bit on the inside, which is the taco. Anyway, so there's all sorts of definitions we can do. But the idea is you kind of understand Moses' predicament. Like we uniquely kind of get what Moses must have been feeling like. And then Moses kind of steps out and says, you know what, I'm going to be an Israelite, right? Because there's that story of how Moses saw an Egyptian slave master beating down an Israelite. And Moses decides he's going to rescue the Israelite, and he ends up killing the Egyptian slave master, buries him because he doesn't want anyone to know, right? And then the next day he sees two Israelites arguing, and he tries to break up the fight. And the Israelites, why are you trying to break up our fight, right? Are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? And Moses realizes that, oh no, people found out what I did. He finds out that Pharaoh wants to kill him, and so what does Moses do? He flees, right? So the place that he grew up in, he leaves it, goes into the wilderness, and then is adopted into sort of this Midianite family. And he's not a Midianite, right? He doesn't worship the Midianite God. He's not ethnically a Midianite. So he's even more of a foreigner in this place. He doesn't have their culture. And so when his firstborn son is born, Moses is thinking, Moses' life at that point is basically, I'm a stranger in a foreign land. I don't actually belong here. I'm actually exiled, right? Like I am not in the place that I'm necessarily supposed to be. And he might be comfortable with that, right? He might be thinking I can build a good life here. But you can tell from the way that he names his son that in his heart, he feels disconnected. He feels like he's not in the place that he's supposed to be. And what's really interesting is the way he names his second-born son. Look at verse 4. And the name of the other, Eliezer, for he said, the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. Right? What's really interesting is Moses' second-born son seems to be coming from a different emotional state. Right? Where he's no longer identifying as a foreigner, but actually he says, God is my helper. God rescued me from the sword of Pharaoh. So clearly something happened in between the firstborn son and the second-born son, and you can all guess what that is. But what's really interesting is why are we given these details? Right? When you read the Bible, don't assume these stories are just slapped together for no reason. There's a reason why these stories are here. And I think one of the things is this is such a grand narrative of how God rescues the Israelites and how he does all this stuff. So you can get lost in this idea that the thing that God cares about the most is getting his glory through this massive amount of people. And actually you would be right, because that's clearly what the story is talking about. But God gives us chapter 18 and little sort of character family moments to remind us that God also cares about each individual person. And Moses' story is the one that we get deep insight into. And Moses is the one, because he's the one that wrote this book. He's sharing, guys, yes, God did these amazing things in the life of the Israelites and in the nation. But God also did something amazing in me. And that's what Moses is trying to share. He's sharing about how God not only rescues the Israelites, but God rescued me, right? I was out. I was a stranger in a foreign land. I was feeling disconnected. I wasn't feeling at home. I was feeling alone and outside. And what God did was he called me in the burning bush. He called me to him and said, I want you to be the one that's going to lead the Egyptians, or lead the Israelites out of Egypt, right? God basically turns Moses into a Pokemon and says, I choose you, and puts him in a Moses Pokeball and throws it at Israel, right? And so that happens, and so Moses is able to rescue them out. But Moses' understanding of who he is when he comes out of Egypt is totally different. And he says, now I know God is my helper. That's really, really helpful for us. That's really useful for us. Because the truth is, we should be identifying with this too. Not only do we have this sort of dual culture thing in us, where we're like not sure if we're Asian, we're not sure if we're American, maybe we're both, and what does that look like? We also struggle with loneliness. We also struggle with being alone. We also struggle with feeling like a stranger sometimes. And I think that's super clear, more so in your generation than in generations past. By the way, when I say your generation, I really mean junior high students, high school students, and even college students. I've been in youth ministry for a really long time, and so I would say like 10 years ago, the kinds of students that were walking in through the doors were literally different from you guys now. And one of the big ways in which you see that is in the ways that your generation specifically deals with loneliness in a way that the previous generation didn't have to deal with. And part of it is just, it's kind of the shape of your life. And when I say the shape of your life, I mean the habits that you form, right? So 10 years ago, the smartphone wasn't as big as it is now. In fact, almost nobody had a smartphone. If 10 years ago a junior high student had a smartphone, their parents also drove a Mercedes-Benz and their house was 9,000 square feet, okay? It's like one kid maybe. And he had no one to iMessage because iMessage didn't exist back then, okay? And no one else had iMessage. It's just him by himself. But what I am saying is that 10 years ago, like the way in which people interacted is different from the way you guys interact now. So like 10 years ago, we didn't have this building. But 10 years ago, we were using probably the gym over there, or we were in that building over there as a junior high ministry, high school ministry. And basically what we would do is we would have people gather in between 9:30 and 11 o'clock service. You know how the outside area kind of fills up with people and people are waiting and stuff. And what I've noticed is, like, over the years, increasingly, the way in which you interact with each other is through sort of a screen, right? So, again, 10 years ago, when no one had a phone, you would have to sit down somewhere and you just have to kind of have conversations. People would play little games, card games, people would arm wrestle. Like, there would be this sort of physical interaction, right? But when I come outside now and see kind of the way you guys interact, it's you're next to each other, but you're all sort of interacting through the screen. And there are moments where you see girls kind of surrounding a table, and they're all individually looking at a screen and all laughing. So they're like doing something together, and yet the interaction is all happening through a screen, right? Now, I'm not saying, okay, that what you're doing is bad and it's worse, okay? I want you guys to understand that, okay? And what I mean by that is it's simply the shape of your life. It's simply different, okay? I don't want you to think that I'm one of those like old people who looks at you guys and be like, get off my lawn, you and your tiny phones, right? Like, I'm just saying that that's what's different, right? And so what that leads to is you guys suffering, like your generation as a whole, suffering from loneliness in a way that other generations don't. Like, they have other issues, trust me. But this one's particular to you. And what I mean by that is, when you go to sleep at night, okay, and you take your phone, you charge it, right? After you've looked at everything that you did that day, you put your phone down and you charge it, and you're about to go to sleep. And then this is really common. Like, there's a thought that creeps in your mind. There's a thought that creeps in your heart. That you just feel kind of empty, that you don't feel fully satisfied. Like, there's something about your life at the end of the day where you don't feel like you got taken care of. You don't feel like you were heard. You don't feel like you were able to say everything you wanted to say. Like, there's just sort of this incompleteness to the end of your day. And if you do that night after night after night, week after week after week, eventually you will end up in a depression. Eventually you'll end up like feeling alone. And that aloneness has nothing to do with how many friends you have on social media, how many group chats you're involved with, how many people you're talking to throughout the week. It actually has nothing to do with that. It literally has to do with the fact that as human beings, we're designed to be around other people. Even from a scientific, biological perspective. Like, when you are near other people, they put off pheromones, they put off chemicals. And my body also puts off chemicals. And when those chemicals mix together, it makes me happy, right? It's a weird thing. That's actually, scientists call this like, there's like a love pheromone, that when you're attracted to somebody, there's this invisible chemistry that comes out of you, and there's this invisible chemistry that comes out of someone else that's attracted to you, and that's how true love happens or whatever. And there's a scientific explanation for those kinds of things. But the idea is, it's pointing to the truth that God created us for connection. God created us for fellowship. God created us for koinonia. And you can have conversation, you can have fun even, you can have inside jokes, you can have meme-tastic moments together through your phones. But what you're missing is physical, embodied relationship connection. And when you lose that, even if you have a ton of friends, even if you have a ton of conversation, you're busy all the time on your phone, you're busy connecting with people, at the end of the day, when you put your phone away, something's missing, something's empty. You feel like you're just not fully connected. You feel like a stranger and a foreigner. In other words, you feel kind of like Moses did when he was in Midian, where he was safe and he was comfortable, he was married, he had a family. Basically, everything that you think you'd want on paper, he has it. And yet, when he names his son, what does he name his son? Like, I'm a stranger in a foreign land. Like, something was missing. But what does God do? God comes into Moses' life at that moment and basically shows up and says, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to choose you. Even though you're not talented, right? Moses says, I don't speak well. So some theologians think that maybe Moses had a stutter. And so Moses says, I don't speak well. Like, why are you choosing me? And God basically says, because I care for you. And I know there's a lot of us in this room, like, we totally identify with this. Like, there is something. You're right. At the end of the day, when I put my phone down and I lay down in bed, like, I just don't feel like I fully connected with somebody. I don't feel like I was fully heard by somebody. I don't feel like I fully gave myself to somebody and somebody else fully gave themselves to me. Now, you've never articulated this, right? None of you guys are like talking to your therapist or your parents and articulate. You're not saying these kinds of things. And yet I know that this is what's clear on what's happening for a lot of you guys. And I want you to see right here, in these random verses about Moses' family, that this is God's way of communicating to you. He hears you. He knows where you're at. He knows what you're going. And he cares for you. He has this desire to fulfill that place of loneliness and need. That's God's desire. He wants to do that. And you see God doing that through Moses, because again, Moses names his son Eliezer. God is my helper. Right? Now, we'll move on a little bit and we'll see how all this ties together. Look at verse 5. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the mountain of God. And when he sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons and with her. Verse 7, Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. Now, I think this is such a random, totally weird situation culturally, because I want you to imagine, okay, so you guys know my family, you guys know I'm married to Tracy, you know I have 3 kids, right? And you also know that Tracy's dad is Pastor Troy, the senior pastor of our church. So the senior pastor of our church is actually my father-in-law. So imagine, okay, let's say we did like a 3-month missions trip, okay? We went to Colorado State for 3 months. I took all the junior high students and we were there for 3 months. And then Pastor Troy decided to take Tracy and my kids to Las Vegas, because Las Vegas is kind of close to Colorado City. And on the way to Las Vegas, he decided, you know what, let's just keep going and let's visit Colorado City. And then he goes to Colorado City and he comes out of the minivan, and the first thing I do is I come and I give Pastor Troy a hug and I kiss him. Not like mouth to mouth, that's gross. I'm talking like cheek to cheek, like French kissing, you know what I'm talking about? Not French kissing, I meant like the way French people kiss each other on the cheek. Man, I'm not speaking properly today. Stop picturing it. Okay, so the idea is like, if he did that, like people would be like, you guys would be like, dude, he hadn't seen his wife and kids for 3 months. Why is he like hugging Pastor Troy first? Like, you'd be like, that's so weird, right? And the idea is, whenever I read this, I would think to myself, man, if I were Zipporah, I'd be pissed. Like, I'd be so mad. Like, Moses! And then Moses runs to Jethro. Just left us hanging. But actually, there's a reason why this is happening. The reason why this is happening is because this was a patriarchal culture. What that means is that the father is the head of the household. They're like the king, right? Imagine if the president, not this president, but maybe a president you like, okay? Imagine that they're the president, okay? And they're with your family, right? And then you go visit the White House. I mean, it's the White House, it's the president. I mean, yeah, your family's important, but you're gonna pay your respects to the president first, right? Because they're the most important person. So really, what we're shown here is Moses' respect and honor for Jethro. Okay? So don't take this as like Moses hates his family. You need to take this as actually Moses really respects Jethro. He really loves and honors Jethro. That's the way you need to see it. So Jethro is a good guy. It's just that he's not an Israelite that doesn't worship Yahweh. Okay? I'm not going to say he's not a Christian, because Christians didn't exist at this point, but he's not a worshiper of Yahweh. And it says in verse 7, so Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down and kissed him, and they asked each other of their welfare, meaning they asked each other how they're doing, and went into the tent, and then went into Moses' house. Verse 8. Then Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had come upon them in the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. And this is really cool. What Moses does is he brings Jethro into his house, and he actually proceeds to give him the gospel from the Old Testament. He actually proceeds to share his faith. He evangelizes to Jethro. And I think that's really cool. And I think that's pointing to something that's really helpful for us. Right? You have friends that you want to share the gospel with. You have friends you would like to evangelize to. You have family members that you'd like to evangelize to. So this verse, these series of verses is helpful. Okay, check it out. This is how Moses does it. He tells his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake. In other words, he proclaims Yahweh's power over the Egyptians. And the reason why that's important is because when it came time for Moses to help Jethro understand who God is, Moses uses the thing that Jethro would understand. Right? So Jethro is the head of the household. Jethro is a priest in the Midianite community. Jethro is a powerful man. And so the way in which Moses appeals to Jethro to show him that God is also worthy of his worship is he says, look how powerful God is. Right? Because Jethro is interested in power. Jethro is a powerful person. So Moses to come alongside Jethro and show him that actually, no, God, Yahweh, is way more powerful than you can even possibly imagine, that's attractive to Jethro. So one of the things that I want you guys to understand is when you are sharing the gospel with somebody, when you're evangelizing to somebody, what you want to do is you don't want to make apologies for God. Because I see a lot of Christians do that. Like they feel like one of the things you have to do is, culturally, God seems like he's limiting you, and God seems like he doesn't want you to have fun. And so a lot of times the witnessing technique is, no, God doesn't want you to do that. God actually wants you to, we're apologizing for God. But what Moses does, he doesn't apologize for what God does. He just says, God is powerful. Right? So think about it. What are the types of people, what are the kinds of celebrities maybe, or people that your friends respect and adore. So think about the conversations you have with your friends about, let's say, specific actors or actresses or celebrities or athletes, kind of famous people. What kinds of people do your friends seem to be attracted to, right? Like sometimes you'll hear about movie stars who do really kind things, like they go to hospitals and they visit like the cancer ward and they give stuff to kids and things like that, and that stuff gets viral, and maybe your friend's like, oh my gosh, look at what this person did, they went to this hospital and they did this. Like what they're expressing to you is that they really respect somebody who has a lot of mercy and compassion. And so if you want to talk to your friend about who God is, point to the stories that are merciful and compassionate. Talk to them about how God is merciful and compassionate. So pay attention to the ways in which your friends talk about people they admire. And then from those, try to figure out, okay, why are they admiring this person? What is it that they're doing that's really awesome? And then you share with them that aspect of God that really matches that, right? And then, look at what he does in verse 8. He says, told his father-in-law that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake. And then it says, and all the hardship that had come upon them in the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. This is crucial. Moses doesn't make it seem like the Israelites were rescued and everything went smoothly from there. Like God just provided everything. What Moses does is he says, look, God pulled us out, but it was hard, right? Like the Pharaoh and the Egyptians were coming after us, and God split the Red Sea, and we thought we were going to die, but God rescued us. And then I got into the desert, and these ungrateful people, man, they complained the whole way through the desert, but God took care of us. He rained bread down. Like Moses doesn't cover all of the warts and the wrinkles and the failures of the Israelite people. Because potentially Jethro could be like, why would God save the Israelites? Like, they were saved under this huge miracle, and then all they did was complain for the next couple of weeks. That doesn't make any sense. Why would he do that? But Moses doesn't cover that up. In fact, what Moses does is he helps Jethro see and understand. No, you don't understand. Like, God is caring for us. Like, things are hard, but God is caring for us. Like, he's real with Jethro. He's vulnerable with Jethro. He's honest with him. And sometimes our friends need to hear that. You know, as a Christian, I do struggle. As a Christian, I do struggle with sin. As a Christian, I do struggle with very specific things, but I know that God is working in me through those things. And sometimes your non-Christian friends, your non-Christian family members, that's really encouraging them for them to hear as well. Because often they feel like they don't measure up to God's standard. For you to say, I don't measure up to God's standard either, but He's carrying me through this. That paints a very different picture of God. And so that's what Moses does. That's how he shares the Old Testament gospel with Jethro. And then look at Jethro's reaction, verse 9. And Jethro rejoiced for all the good that the Lord had done to Israel and that he had delivered them out of the hands of the Egyptians. Right? So Jethro rejoices and praises. But it goes further, verse 10. Jethro said, blessed be the Lord who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh and has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods because of this affair. They dealt arrogantly with the people. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God. And Aaron came with all of the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. Like, wow. I don't know if you see this, but essentially Jethro came to Moses as a priest of Midian. And Jethro is going to be leaving from Moses' house, having offered sacrifices to Yahweh, the true God. In other words, having received the gospel of the Old Testament, believing in Yahweh, even going so far as to make sacrifices, and then to have Aaron and all the elders come over. It's almost like a baptism service. They're going to have this meal together. Jethro is going to show the elders and the leaders of Israel, I am a Yahweh worshiper. And you know what's really crazy? So at the beginning of the story, I told you guys Moses is an outsider, and God brings him into the family as an insider. Jethro is the same exact way. Jethro is an outsider. He's a Midianite. But because of everything God does in Israel, what does God do? He pulls Jethro into the family. And he has Jethro see that he is a helper to him. And that's what Jethro says. In other words, we're given the story in Exodus chapter 18 as a way for God to tell us twice. If you feel lonely, if you feel disconnected, if you feel outcast, if you feel like a stranger, if you feel like this church isn't the most friendliest place, if you feel like this place is not a place where you're connecting really well, God sees you, He feels you, He understands you. And if you think that God's not really emphasizing that, He just told us two people where their story is virtually exactly the same. And what God tells us is that His desire is to take your disconnection, your loneliness, your aloneness, your feeling of being a stranger, and He wants to transform you. And He actually wants you to see That by the end of your experience with our church, at the end of this message even, He wants you to see that He wants to do it. He wants to help you. He wants to draw you out. He wants to choose you. He wants to grant His gift of fellowship to you. He wants to grant you this gift of connection. That's God's heart, and that's God's desire. Can I ask you to close your eyes? We're going to close with this. In case you're still not convinced yet that God cares for you, if you're feeling like you're on the outside, if you're not feeling particularly connected, maybe you're feeling a little depressed, or you're feeling a little lonely. The New Testament is all about this person named Jesus, who was never on the in crowd, who was never accepted by the popular people of the day. Jesus, in fact, was such an outcast that eventually those people, they got Jesus killed on a cross. And while Jesus was hanging from the cross, there were people who walked by and mocked Him, spit on Him, talked trash about Him. And Jesus took all of that, and then at the very end, when Jesus needed God the most, you know what happened? God turned His back on Jesus. Because God rejected Jesus and had Him die on the cross alone, so that you and I would never have to be alone ever again through our faith in Him. Jesus took the worst punishment from God. Jesus took rejection from God, so that again, you and I would never have to feel the worst punishment from God. We would never have to be rejected, but that we would be fully accepted because of what Jesus has done. And I think God is inviting a lot of you guys into that relationship here this morning. And He's calling you out. And He's saying, I feel you, I hear you, I see how alone you are. I've seen how sometimes you cry at school because you're by yourself and you're alone. I see sometimes how bitter you are about coming to church, and you're just hesitant to get out of the car because you're just not feeling it. And I see like you want to participate in things, and yet there's this catch-22. Are my friends going to be there? Is anybody I'm going to know? And God's saying, trust in me. Don't put your trust in your friends. Trust in me. Don't put your trust in your phone. Trust in me. Don't put your trust in whatever you use to kind of make those feelings of loneliness disappear. Well, God is saying, I want to draw that out. I want to fully expose that, and then I want to meet that need. And so would you be like Moses and Jethro, and would you respond? So I'm going to ask you this morning to just kind of reflect and ask God and cry out to Him and pray. Just pray, God, I feel this way. I feel disconnected. I feel alone. I feel like a stranger. God, I just need you to help me in this regard. I need you to help me in this area. Just spend a few moments bringing that prayer to God and ask Him to help you to trust in Him to meet your needs. Father, in this room, there's people coming from all walks of life. There are people in this room who struggle with this particular thing a little bit more than others. There are those of us who are kind of on the extreme side where we've fallen into depression. And we're just wondering when somebody will pay attention. When will somebody listen? When will I find that somebody who knows me and I know them? And we're looking for that kind of connection from people. There are those of us in the middle who just vaguely feel weirdly disconnected sometimes. And it's uncomfortable to think about why, and so we just kind of push it away, and we push it away, and we push it away. And then there are those of us who don't even know that this is still a problem. And God, among that wide spectrum, I pray that you would minister to each and every single one of us as an individual. That just in the way that you've ministered to Moses, in the way that you specifically ministered to Jethro, that you would specifically minister to us. That as we bring to you the way in which we feel, as we bring to you the way in which we're suffering, as we bring to you the ways in which we feel disconnected, the ways in which we feel like a stranger and a foreigner, I pray, Lord, that you would transform those prayers so that we can begin to declare over our life that God is actually my helper. And God is doing these amazing things in my life, and He is fulfilling me in ways that I'm meant to be fulfilled. I'm meant for connection. I'm meant for bodily connection and physical connection and embodied relationships. But I'm far more created to be connected to my Creator. I'm far more created to be connected to the sovereign God of the universe. And how wonderful it is to have a relationship. I pray, Lord, that you would unearth that desire in us. Be with us. Help us to recognize how important all of this is. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.